Hello, hello. Welcome to our third knowledge clip for your Economics of Taxation writing assignment, which is going to be focused on the theoretical framework section. So just to get some general details out of the way first, for your theoretical framework, I would recommend that it's around 1 to 1.2K words. Definitely, I would recommend that it is one of the larger parts of your writing assignment, since this is where you are really, as the goal says, describing relevant information and literature that helps you answer your central or research question. So this is something that, of course, you already introduced in your introduction, but you really want to, dive into this further with the literature and with some key concepts and factors. So you really want to, in the theoretical framework, include the topics and characteristics that are relevant to the OECD pillars that you have chosen. The really core essence of the theoretical framework is to provide this essential background and also context into how the factors have been basically analyzed in previous literature. So how have these pillars been analyzed, or a certain section of the pillar been analyzed in previous literature. Then you also want to create some criteria and do a small analysis of these factors, and then link that to your research question both in the theoretical framework and then also in the conclusion for your sort of final statement. In this case, the theoretical framework is, as I would personally recommend, going to be a little bit also of an analysis section, just simply because you don't have a proper analysis moment in the paper in a dedicated section. So I'm sort of splitting it up into the theoretical framework and also into the conclusion, but really diving into it a bit deeper in terms of the theoretical framework. In terms of your assignment itself, again, it's asking you to focus on a specific part of the OECD Pillar 1 and 2 proposals and initiatives. You essentially want to draw some particular conclusions, have a research question based on this. Some key things for the theoretical framework is that you should define, of course, key concepts regarding your research question. Also define DTA, OECD Pillar 1 and or Pillar 2, depending on which ones are relevant for your research question. And of course, define other relevant concepts that, again, depend on your central question, and use the literature that has been discussed in class. So you really want to focus on those sort of literature causal relationships, how they relate to your central question, and how you can essentially evaluate the extent to which your central question is valid. So in terms of the actual content and structure of your theoretical framework, I would recommend two main parts, which is the background and the relevant criteria and analysis. So for the background section, this is really a descriptive and explanatory moment for you. So the what and the why. So in terms of describing and defining, I would recommend that you describe and define the current tax system. So how does it work? Who taxes who, etc. Of course, as the course outline says, define a DTA or double tax agreement, and also define and explain the OECD Pillar 1 and or 2 proposals and initiatives. So their goals, are they a success, or other alternative measures, what parts have been implemented, what not, etc. And also, of course, the relevant concepts that you have decided to explore. So really kind of defining those topics, defining anything that is relating to your research question context, and really setting the scene in terms of that for, based on your literature. Then, in terms of these sort of extra definitions or extra concepts, I again would really recommend that you dive deeper into 2 to 3 of them rather than going surface level for 5 to 6, for example. So I would really recommend using concepts and definitions that are very backed by academic articles and by the literature. And of course, this depends also on your central question and what you're focusing on. Then once you've established your background in terms of your key terms, key concepts, and definitions, then I would recommend getting into some relevant criteria and also your analysis. So starting with the criteria, again, you want to reflect on how a chosen section of the OECD Pillar 1 and 2 and or 2 are successful, and also, of course, the extent to which it impacts tax avoidance and or tax collection. Again, very dependent on your research question. And in general, your criteria are essentially ways that you can measure and analyze a part of these pillars or pillar, and essentially analyze if they are effective, feasible, transparent, etc. So your criteria are essentially there to sort of grade your research question on the extent to which it is valid. In terms of examples of criteria that you could use, there are quite a couple. And again, you can use the literature for this and explore some topics. Use also AI to help you for identifying common themes, as I've stated here in the example section. But yeah, you can focus on, for example, complexity, implementation, revenue effects or revenue changes, magnitude of tax evasion or tax collection, and also the quality of the tax policy or tax reports, either public or private, for example. And again, similar to how I mentioned in terms of key definitions and concepts, try to narrow down your criteria into, 3, 4, I would say even 3 is a good maximum to put in terms of being able to explain them with quite a lot of evidence and, of course, relating that back to your research question. So, of course, once you've established your criteria, how are you going to evaluate your research question on sort of what metrics, basically, then I would recommend doing a really brief analysis section. So again, kind of combining it here with the conclusion and theoretical framework and doing a bit of analysis in both. But essentially what I would recommend is to relate the criteria back to your central question and use it to evaluate the extent to which your question is essentially valid or not. In my recommendation, I would say that you solidify these arguments and also, of course, set the scene and set the background with your defined key terms and criteria in the literature in the theoretical framework, and then reiterate these findings in the conclusion. So main part of the explanation should be happening in the theoretical framework, and then the conclusion is also just there to develop these arguments further and relate them back to the central question. Of course, I have some tips on finding literature, but you can have a look at this as well, by pausing the video. But here are some just kind of tips on to help you find those key concepts. And again, as a reminder, your criteria are essentially sort of grading rubric categories. So they're the main concepts that you're going to serve as your measures to get you to your final answer. In terms of the paragraph structure of the theoretical framework, I'm taking this a little bit from my analysis section that I recommended last year and kind of mixing it in with the theoretical framework since, again, it's a bit of a mix this year for where you should put what. But one key thing that I would note is to order your relevant concepts to evaluate a part of the pillar or pillars in order of importance. So focus on, for example, the topics that are most important in evaluating your central question and focus on those first. So start with your strongest arguments in the beginning. So for example, maybe you have transparency and implementation as sort of your categories for what you're going to evaluate the OECD pillar on. And maybe transparency is more important or you found more evidence on it. So then I would put that first. In terms of the actual logical flow of each paragraph, of course, in the very beginning of a theoretical framework, again, that's for that part 1 or that background section for defining those key terms and so on. And then as you're getting into defining your relevant criteria and doing your relevant analysis, that's where I would recommend first, of course, specifying them, defining them, and then per concept or per criteria subtopic, you need to connect it back to your central question. So I would find evidence that is essentially validating the research question based on that particular defined criteria or subtopic. Introduce also some counter literature or some caveats for this criteria relating to your research question. And then lastly, after the counter literature, refute why that may be flawed or not developed enough, and then essentially conclude each paragraph with a connection back to your central question and the extent to which essentially it is valid. So, of course, those are my recommendations based on how the structure has been revised on this year's material. Of course, if your tutorial tutor has a different suggestion, make sure to do that instead, and of course, listen to them first and foremost, as I've said here. But yeah, I think that is going to be basically it for this knowledge clip. I really hope that this has been helpful to give you a bit of a clearer idea on how to structure your theoretical framework. And there will be another video on the conclusion very soon, definitely before your deadline, of course. But yeah, I hope this has been a good help for you to restructure, help you out with your theoretical framework progress. But yeah, then that's going to be it for today, and I will see you in the next knowledge clip.